So Mark, who hardly needs an introduction to this audience, he's represented Port Adelaide since 2007, which makes this, I think, your 21st year in Parliament. And following the 2013 federal election, he became Shadow Minister for Environment, Climate Change and Water. And after the 2016 federal election, the Shadow Minister for Climate Change and Energy. He's also ALP President until the National Conference in July of this year in Adelaide. And he's in a great position to make a difference to Labor Party internal democracy. So please make Mark welcome.
Well, thank you, Julia, and thank you for that very kind introduction. Thank you all for coming along during January, when usually everyone's out at the beach or watching tennis. Can I pay my respects also to the traditional owners of the place we now call Melbourne, and particularly to the elders past and present in the spirit of reconciliation. And also acknowledge my friends and colleagues, Jenny Macklin and Andrew Giles, colleagues in the federal Labor opposition. In Jenny's case, a Labor hero, in Andrew's case, a potential Labor hero. But both of them are great advocates for party democracy and great friends as well. And I also want to acknowledge Frank Maguire, who snuck in at the last minute, the member for Broadmeadows. Thank you, though, all of you, for coming along to have this discussion about party democracy. Can I say at the outset, with a bit of inside knowledge about at least two of the raffle prizes, if you get the chance as a raffle ticket holder, grab the wine. Or unless you have a sort of rickety kitchen table, you need something to sort of stick under one of those legs. This is a really important issue, and I'm just so glad that the Victorian Fabians, that have a well-deserved reputation around the country for being fierce advocates for reform, for democracy within our party, but more broadly within the community of Australia, has been able to host this, along with the John Cain Foundation, the Independence Group, Eric Derricott, who's also a well-known fierce advocate for party reform, we all know. We've all been on the receiving end of those calls, and also to Open Labor. Thank you very, very much. Back in 2015, I had the privilege of being elected National President of the Labor Party on a very clear platform, wanting to contribute to reforms that would see our great party become more democratic and participatory, but also substantially bigger and better organised. More than 2 years later, most of the meaningful changes that were discussed by party members during that ballot have been blocked by factional leaders at the National Conference and at various state conferences. I'm sorry to say that ours remains a party that gives ordinary members fewer rights than any other Labor or Social Democratic party that I can think of. As we begin the year of another national conference, it's time to issue a strong call for the conference in Adelaide this July to grasp the nettle and to give ALP members the range of democratic and participatory rights that members of our sister parties across the world take for granted. Party members should have a vote in the election of all important positions in the party, from federal and state leader down. Importantly, members in all states must be allowed to vote for the candidates we select for Senate and Legislative Council positions. In some states, including here in Victoria, those positions remain a last bastion of backroom dealing by self-appointed factional warlords, a bastion that must be cracked open. Better protections need to be inserted into our rules to stop these newly granted voting rights being suspended or overridden by factional operatives on state and national executive. And it's time, I think, for us to expand the right to participate in Labor ballots beyond full membership to a new category of registered supporter. Holding any position within the Labor Party brings with it a deep responsibility that reaches back to the party's foundation well more than 100 years ago. Even our detractors, I think, will have to admit that Labor holds a unique position in Australian society as the principal protector of a fair go, an equal right to participate in all of the myriad opportunities that our country has to offer its people, regardless of class, creed, or any of the other points of difference that are used to preserve those opportunities for the few rather than for the many. That heritage is precious, requires all of us to work hard, protect it, and to enhance it. Now, of course, reasonable, well-meaning people can disagree about what that exactly means. A political party doesn't last 130 years in a dynamic country like Australia by standing still or resting comfortably on its laurels. But there is value in tradition and in not lightly discarding ways of organising ourselves that have worked well in the past. And striking that balance is the core challenge in so-called party reform. Let me at the outset point out the blindingly obvious, that Labor hasn't lasted this long because of our internal structures and our culture. Some might even argue we've lasted this long in spite of them. Labor's success, its longevity and its central place in the history of Australian economic and social reform all rest overwhelmingly on the power of Labor's ideas, our relentless vision for Australia and its people. Drawing on Labor's timeless core values, each generation has crafted a platform that reflects the challenges and the opportunities of a particular age. And that's exactly what Labor is doing right now. The National Policy Forum is working over the summer to prepare first drafts of the platform that will be considered at our national conference in Adelaide this July. In the meantime, we continue to lead the debates, the national debates in the complex, fast-moving policy areas. Chris Bowen, for example, is already building on his exceptional work in the last term of Parliament and pulling together the most progressive, thoughtful economic platform Labor's had in many years. Penny Wong spent 2017, on top of her demanding workload as Senate leader, setting out Labor's thoughts on the complex global scene, as every opposition must do if they aspire to run a substantial and active middle power like Australia. And I'm sure she's going to yell it out, but I've lost count of the number of Liberal ministers that Jenny Macklin has dispatched from the complex social services portfolio in that battle of ideas over the last 4 or 5 years. While ideas, vision and policy detail lie at the centre of Labor's success, though, they are not the whole story, because Labor is not a think tank. Labor is a movement of people working together to make their country a better place. And that's what we're thinking about when we talk about party reform. How do we keep our movement, Labor's ability to mobilise vast numbers behind our ideas, as strong as it was during the It's Time campaign in '72, strong as it was during the 5 election victories that Hawke and Keating had, or as strong as it was during the Your Rights at Work campaign and the Kevin 07 juggernaut that dispatched John Howard finally? How do we keep our party match fit? Well, the first challenge is to admit when you have a problem, and we do. While our party organisation is certainly not dying, the most generous description I can think of is that we're treading water. Party membership is hovering a little over 50,000 and, disturbingly, has actually declined by more than 6% since its recent peak in 2015. Consider that British Labor recruited 35,000 new members in just 4 days after the 2017 election, bringing our sister party's membership not to 50,000 but to 550,000 members. Our members here in Australia are hard-working, motivated believers in the Labor mission, but as a group we are not representative of the broader Australian population. We are older than average and predominantly male. Our primary problem, though, is that we are too small. In a nation pushing 25 million souls, 50,000 members does not allow us to credibly claim to be a mass membership party anymore. And for progressive parties, size matters. Unlike our Conservative opponents, who enjoy largesse from the big end of town, we rely on a huge number of small contributions to finance our campaigns through membership fees and the collective contribution of trade union members. As campaigning becomes more complex and more expensive, it's no secret that our finances are not what they might be. Again, compare that to British Labor, which tripled its income from membership fees over just 5 years, to an Australian equivalent, adjusted for population size, of $10 million every year. Beyond finances, though, progressive parties require an army of supporters to get out there and make the case for progressive change. You don't need an army to spruik the case for keeping things the way they've always been. But change is hard. and change requires tens of thousands of shoulders to the wheel. We need to be honest that our party itself is no longer capable of organising a substantial on-the-ground campaign beyond elections and by-elections. Party members played an important role in the mass mobilisation of the Your Rights at Work campaign 10 years ago, but it was a support role to the work of the unions. We can't compare today in scale to the organising capacity today of groups like GetUp, and the extraordinary organising effort of the Yes campaign in last year's marriage equality survey would have been way beyond the capacity of our party alone, even though it was heavily driven by some of our best campaigners, like the director of our 2007 election victory, Tim Gartrell. These and other progressive campaigns are inspiring and they're often highly successful, but while the party brings enormous intellectual capacity to bear, our membership base is simply too small to play much more than a support role in any grassroots effort. The relative stultification of our internal organisation has also permitted machine politics to continue to dominate parts of our party. Before Christmas, for example, reports emerged of a new carve-up of influence and positions in the Victorian branch. Remarkably, I think at least, the designers of this new pact have already decided who the party's candidate will be for a seat that hasn't even yet been created, the new federal seat in Victoria. We don't know where in Victoria it will be, what community will be represented, the views of local party members and supporters, or whether this person has any connection whatsoever with the area ultimately chosen by the Electoral Commission. That sort of backroom buffoonery does not reflect a healthy party organisation. Now, perhaps all of this would only be of passing interest to political scientists and our remaining party members if our external working environment were all beer and skittles. But as we all know, the environment for major parties has never been tougher in Australia, and the position for federal Labor is much tougher, I think, than the predictions by commentators of a cruisy victory at the next federal election would suggest. Last summer, two of the most talented of Kevin Rudd's impressive crop of young staffers, Andrew Charlton and Lachlan Harris, wrote, I think, an excellent analysis of the rise of populism and third parties in the monthly magazine, a piece called A Pox on Both Your Houses. The reasons for this dynamic have been well traversed by many of my colleagues, and I won't repeat them tonight. In terms of electoral impact, though, Charlton and Harris point out that of the almost 500,000 primary votes that Malcolm Turnbull lost the coalition in 2016, 3/5 of those votes shifted to third parties rather than the Labor Party. Labor's primary vote, at less than 35%, was only 1.3% higher than the record low figure we recorded in 2013, a smaller swing than the Greens Party managed of 1.6%. In the House of Reps, almost 1 in 4 voters chose third parties rather than Labor, Liberal or Nationals candidates. While the House crossbench only numbers 5 MPs at the moment, Charlton and Harris point out that 12,000 votes cast differently in 4 seats would have delivered the Greens and Nick Xenophon 4 additional seats between them. And it's not difficult to identify even more seats at risk in the future to the Greens, One Nation or the Nick Xenophon party. This trend represents a very serious challenge to Labor's ability over time to win majority government, remembering that even Kevin 07's juggernaut delivered a majority of just 8 seats. While the party's two-party preferred vote is sitting consistently above 50%, our primary vote remains stubbornly low, moving in Newspoll between 36% and 38% last year, but ending the year at 37%. For context, Kim Beazley attracted a primary vote consistently in the 40s through 2001, reaching as high as 48% until the impact of 9/11 and a number of other events brought our vote back to the high 30s. And that was at a time when the combined Democrats and Greens vote was also running at between 9 and 13%. Labor, under even Mark Latham, also polled consistently more than 40% through 2004, and Kevin Rudd in 2007 never dropped below 45%, even reaching a primary vote above 50% at times. Rudd's two-party preferred vote through 2007, right up to the date the election was called, averaged more than 56%, but came in almost 4% lower than that on election day. Latham led every news poll bar one through 2004 on a two-party preferred vote, including the two immediately before the election was actually called, recording 52 and 54% on a two-party preferred vote in those two polls. But by election day, as we know, our vote had collapsed to 47%. Now, there are reasons for all of those shifts in the numbers, but they all point to a danger of complacency about any election, including the next one. And complacency in the face of the rise of populism and third parties is, I think, especially risky. Charlton and Harris suggest that there are typically two responses by major parties to a rise in populism. The first is to copy it, an approach obviously fixed upon, you Victorians understand better than most, over recent months by Malcolm Turnbull, but I'm glad that Labor has rejected that. The second is to try to become such a small target that no one notices you. Now, I remember that being a point of fierce debate after the 2001 election, for example, but I don't think anyone can make the claim that federal Labor at the moment is shirking our responsibility to put out ambitious and detailed policy. We are running a risk, however, of trying to present a small target in failing to confront the challenge that this phenomenon of populism and third parties presents to our party organisation. Respect for the major parties is running at historically low levels, and that's not a lack of respect for our ideas or our policy, it's a lack of respect for our party organisation. As Charlton and Harris put it, major political parties will need to adapt their structures in ways that build respect, trust, authenticity, conviction and participation. Continuing to practice the old ways of machine politics will see trust in the Labor Party continue to wither away. The calls for meaningful reform of our party structures have been long-standing and they've been broadly based. They reflect the views of the overwhelming bulk of party members, I think, and of many supporters who might be considering whether to take the plunge and to join us. And they've been made for many years by our party's most successful and esteemed leaders. Bob Hawke and Neville Wran worked hard at a blueprint for reform more than 15 years ago, a report that was then cherry-picked by a Rules Conference in 2002. Steve Bracks, Bob Carr and John Faulkner in 2010, or after the 2010 election, picked up those remaining threads of the Hawke-Wran report and tried again. In receiving their report, Julia Gillard said pointedly, "Some hold that the historic structures of the Labor Party are sufficient to the complex and personalised politics of today. I do not," she said. Again, though, the following National Conference rejected the key structural reforms that were proposed in that report. And in the leadership election of 2013, both candidates, Bill Shorten and Anthony Albanese, both promised party members that they would pursue meaningful reform if elected. Bill followed that up in a detailed speech to the Wheeler Centre in early 2014, when he said, "If we don't change, we are putting our very future at risk." But again, the 2015 National Conference rejected a number of the key structural reforms that were proposed in Bill's speech. I've been arguing the case for our party to become more democratic and participatory for too many years now. At the 2002 Special National Rules Conference, I moved that the first, number one recommendation from the Hawke-Wran report be adopted, a recommendation that party members will get to vote for a component, just a component, of the National Conference, the party's supreme decision-making body. That motion was seconded by Luke Foley and it was roundly defeated. The recommendation was echoed strongly in the 2011 report from Bracks, Carr and Faulkner, but again it was defeated by factional leaders at the following conference. Finally, at the 2015 National Conference, party members were granted the right to elect a minority share of the National Conference's delegates, thanks largely to some leadership exercised by delegates, frankly, across the factional spectrum in our largest branch, New South Wales, as well as Bill Shorten's support. I am most concerned, though, at the refusal of key factional leaders to allow party members a direct vote to select our Senate candidates. In his speech to the Wheeler Centre, Bill referred to some rancour that had surrounded the then recent Senate pre-selection process in Western Australia, concluding that there had to be, in his words, real change that would give local party members a meaningful say in the selection of Senate candidates. Bill asked the National Executive to work with the WA branch to develop a model in the branch that could then be considered across the country. To their credit, the branch did the hard work and came up with such a model, but the then leader of the New South Wales Right used the National Executive to block the reform, and so it died. That episode, it must be said, was something I think of an aberration in the attitude taken by the New South Wales Right in recent years to party reform. As I said earlier, New South Wales moved to allow their members a vote for National Conference delegates before conference itself finally grasped the nettle. The New South Wales Right also helped to drive the experiments in community pre-selections of party candidates in a number of state seats, as well as the Sydney City Council. And prominent New South Wales Right figures like Chris Bowen and Sam Dastyari were among the earliest advocates for the reforms to the election of the Labor leader, allowing members a vote in that election, that were adopted in 2013. I think happily for the party, the new General Secretary, Kayla Murnane, sits firmly in that reform mould. Here in Victoria, by contrast, there has been a powerful group of factional leaders apparently determined to block even those reforms proposed by Bill Shorten. I'm told, for example, that a proposal to give Victorian members a vote in selecting Senate candidates didn't even make it to the floor of the last Victorian conference before being discharged by the Rules Committee. Reforms that allow members a vote for the party's Senate candidates have now been adopted by the majority of our branches, with the notable exception of our two largest branches, New South Wales and Victoria, and for reasons I explained and largely beyond their control, Western Australia. This situation must change. Not only are these the most significant positions from which party members remain completely disenfranchised, they are also the positions most at risk in the shift to third parties. Now, Labor's primary vote in the House of Reps in 2016 was better than 2013, but it's still the second lowest primary vote we've recorded in the House in many decades. And that was against, I think, the weakest campaign the Coalition has run in almost a quarter of a century. But our Senate primary vote was even worse. Labor's primary Senate vote in 2016 dropped below 30% for the first time since 1903, coming in lower than the 2013 election. Only a decade ago, at the 2007 election, Labor's primary vote in the Senate was 40%. In 2010, it was still 35%. In just a decade, 1 in 4 votes cast for the Labor Party's Senate ticket has left us. The selection of Senate candidates continues to present, I think, the most common reminder that too often key decisions in our party are made by the few rather than the many. This last bastion of backroom deals must be cracked open, and members should be given a vote also in casual vacancy situations. Such an approach would mitigate the air of rancour that too often surrounds the filling of casual Senate vacancies through highly centralised factional processes. Over the years, I've heard a variety of arguments against party reform. I think I've heard them all. Some argue against reform as being anti-union or a thinly disguised power grab by the left of the party. Opponents will also suggest from time to time that reform involves us talking about ourselves rather than focusing on issues that matter to Australian households, that it's a distraction from our real job. While that objection, I think, holds a little more water, I'm still firmly convinced that a failure to modernise and democratise our party will, over time, seriously hamper our ability to do our real job. And it's worth pointing out that some of the strongest reform advocates over the past 2 decades have included some of our party's most successful election-winning leaders, like Hawke, Rann, Carr and Bracks, neither of whom, I think, could ever be described as self-indulgent navel-gazers. A more recent argument, though, marshalled by some against party reform, has been that we'll end up like British Labor. with a radical left leader who is unacceptable to the electorate. Now, it's important, considering that argument, to point to a distinction in Britain, I think. Their lack of any proportionally elected chamber of parliament, such as our Senate, means that there is limited opportunity for a minor party like the Greens to gain a foothold in the political scene, creating a gravity that pulls more hard left supporters, if you like, and activists towards the Labor Party. This is not an especially new phenomenon, as I'm sure you know. British Labor has had larger hard left tendencies, if you like, than the ALP for many, many years now. There are many reasons, I think, for Jeremy Corbyn's success within British Labor, but prominent among them, and often underreported, is the lack of well-organised, inspiring opposition. Charlton and Harris quote the well-known British MP John Cruddas, who said that the Blairites woke up to find a party that had totally disappeared in front of them. They didn't know what to do. Both of the two leadership elections that were won by Corbyn revealed a deep lack of basic party organisation, as well as an absence, I think, of compelling personnel and vision on the part of the so-called moderates in British Labor. British Labor is now the largest political party in Europe by a mile, probably about 11 times as big as our party here in Australia. Its growth off the back of a serious party reform agenda has been simply extraordinary. Some individual constituencies are now able to call on several thousand members and registered supporters living in just one seat to campaign for a Labor victory. This new category in Britain of registered supporter essentially is an individual who wants to participate in the party, including by voting in leadership elections, without taking out full membership. Controversially, registered supporters initially in Britain only paid the equivalent of $5 to register and to get a vote in the leadership election. In 2016, that registration fee was increased to the equivalent of $45, and still they signed up in droves. The idea of registered supporter reflects, I think, the way in which an increasing number of people would choose to participate in progressive political activity, including in the affairs of a country's main progressive political party. To be frank, much of the traditional fare of our party's membership, including the legendary branch meeting, fails to excite many of our strong supporters. Interestingly too, I think, the British Parliamentary Library's analysis shows that the Labor Party's registered supporters are more representative of the community than its full members. While both groups are aged a little over 50 on average, the supporter group is half female, while party members are overwhelmingly male, as they are here in the ALP. Supporters are also much closer to the community average when it comes to graduate and SES status, with party members far more likely to have a university degree and to live in the highest SES areas than community. Overall, these changes in Britain have brought an extraordinary level of energy to the party. In 2016, more than 500,000 individual votes were cast in Labor's leadership ballot, more than 500,000, compared to 30,000 votes that were cast here in the ALP 3 years ago. British Labor's members are enthused and they're active. The orthodox view that reform equals Corbyn equals electoral oblivion, I think, has also been challenged somewhat by the result last year, where, in England at least, Labor's primary vote increased by more than 10%, and the Tory government was deprived of a parliamentary majority. And to those who are concerned that Corbyn's hard left agenda is an unavoidable extension of party reform, I'd remind them that the ALP rules still give 50% of the vote for the leader to the caucus. But I'd also say, have more faith in the moderate voice within the ALP to organise better and to present a more compelling narrative and vision within our party than their equivalents in British Labor, frankly, have done. Over the past couple of decades, in contrast to the experience in Britain, the Australian Labor Party has arguably only made 2 meaningful reforms to our party. While the 2002 and 2015 national conferences, I think, were a disaster from the perspective of broader democratisation, they both achieved great reform for gender equality in our party. Our affirmative action rules have been hugely important in broadening our appeal in the community and our talent pool in the parliament. The second major change was effectively forced on the party through Kevin Rudd's insistence in 2013 that the process of electing the party leader include a vote from party members. Even as the campaign manager for the candidate who lost that ballot in 2013, I can say that's the best process I've ever experienced in our party by a very long way. It energised and it grew our party membership in a way I've never seen before. And it did so at a time when the party desperately needed a cauterising experience after too many years of disunity and poor discipline. Over 2 decades, though, that's a pretty sorry record, and it needs to change this year. This year's National Conference must have a serious debate about reform, not a truncated, chaotic debate of the type we've seen pushed to the end of the agenda at the last 2 national conferences. The National Conference must require all branches to provide party members with a substantial vote to select Senate and Legislative Council candidates, including casual vacancies. And federal rules that give members a vote for federal leader and national president should be reflected across all of our branches for the equivalent state positions, as some branches have already done with the support of Bill Shorten. The rules should provide for a safety mechanism that prevents members from being deprived of a vote through executive intervention. The Victorian rules, for example, provide for members to vote to select the party's Legislative Council candidates, but it was overridden by the executive in each of the first 3 Victorian elections that occurred under that rule. The national rule should provide that state rules that grant members a vote in party ballots can only be overridden by a supermajority of the national executive, rather than the vote of one faction. As Bill said in his Wheeler Centre speech, from now on, intervention by the national executive should be the exception, not the rule. And the National Conference should determine a path, I think, that expands participatory and voting rights in our party beyond formal membership to a category of registered supporter who is able to vote alongside members in all important party ballots. The New South Wales branch should be congratulated on its leadership in this area, but it's time to take this concept beyond the experimental phase. This will help us roll out a more structured approach to party organisation of the type that is so commonplace in trade unions, because our party simply must get bigger and it must get better organised. The Bracks, Carr and Faulkner review also recommended that the 3 national presidential positions be granted a vote on the executive. Ironically, the only national positions that have been directly elected by party members were deliberately left without voting rights at the 2002 National Conference. And there has never been a sound reason, I think, advanced to deny a vote to those democratically elected positions. And in his 2014 Wheeler Centre speech, Bill Shorten said, "If we are truly serious about modernising the Labor Party, we need to modernise our relationship with the union movement." Like Bill, I proudly served for more than a decade as a union secretary before entering Parliament, and I cherish the relationship between political and industrial labour. But I've also said previously that there is value in considering the sorts of changes seen in Britain that deal union members more directly into that relationship rather than always seeing it operate through union secretaries. Such changes should be considered in the context of a meaningful response by Labor to the deep challenges facing unions in Australia today, particularly in the private sector, and I'll be talking later next week about some ideas in that direction. Friends, such a package of reforms would, I'm confident, see our great party move from simply treading water to cementing its place as a mass movement for the 21st century. This hard work at getting our show in shape, getting our show in order, has to be done in opposition, which means doing it this year. I'm confident that members will voice their support for these changes, as they did during the party president election in 2015. And if no one else will stand at the microphone in Adelaide this July and make the case for these meaningful reforms, then I sure as hell will. Thank you.